All right. Exodus 7, again, first 13 verses. What we're really going to camp on today is the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, which in this chapter, it's not the first time we run into that phrase, that language. It has occurred up to this point, but this is sort of, where it kicks in. So I'm going to read the first 13 verses, and there's going to be one thing I want to comment on before we get to the hardening, but that's basically where we're going to be camping out today. So this is Moses and Aaron meeting with Pharaoh. So they're before Pharaoh. First verse says, "And the Lord said to Moses, See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them." Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "When Pharaoh says to you, 'Prove yourselves by working a miracle,' then you shall say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it may become a serpent.'" So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron cast down his staff before Pharaoh and his servants, and it became a serpent. Then Pharaoh summoned the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, the magicians of Egypt, also did the same by their secret arts. For each man cast down his staff, and they became serpents, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Still Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. So that's the first 13 verses. We've commented on a few things in there already about this confrontation. The one new thing before we get to the hardening topic is in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet." Now, some people, I think, I'll use the word foolishly, presume this wording means that Elohim are men. In other words, they'll use this verse as a justification for the notion that, well, see, Elohim can be people, and then we take that back to Psalm 82, blah, 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 blah. Of course, we never turn to Psalm 89, where the divine council is in the skies. You don't have a bunch of men ruling the nations in the skies. Again, we forget about Psalm 89 and other passages, but again, we know the drill here on the podcast. Again, if divine council stuff is new to you, watch the videos on the podcast website where it says if you're new, start here. Go to my website, thedivinecouncil.com, and you can get up to speed there. This verse doesn't support that notion at all. That's not the point at all. Moses is not really an Elohim. The point is one of analogy. Okay, God here is making an analogy for and about Moses in relation to Pharaoh. So, let's go back to Exodus 4. To sort of get the point of the analogy. In Exodus 4, 14 through 16, we read this. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. Moses says he doesn't want to go, to Egypt. And he said, "Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be your mouth, or with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him." So that's the other part of this analogy. Think of it this way. There's God, and when God calls a prophet, when God picks a spokesperson, God speaks to that person, and then that person speaks to other people. So God has called Moses. Moses is the mouthpiece of God to other people. He is to speak God's words. But what we have going on here is that Moses, again, is speaking to who? Well, it depends on the passage. When Exodus 7:1 says, God says to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet." It's as though Moses is sort of in the God slot. And then Moses gives his word to Aaron, and Aaron speaks to Pharaoh. So in Pharaoh's perception, Moses is sort of playing the role that the deity would normally play. The deity would normally tell what the spokesman to say, and then he would say it to somebody else. Well, here what you have going on is Moses is telling, Aaron what to say, and of course Moses is getting it from God, but now we've got this one step removed because Moses doesn't, want to talk, to people, or he can't talk, or he stutters, or whatever it is. So Aaron's brought into the picture. And the whole point is one of analogy. It's not that God says, "Hey, Moses, you're an Elohim now." No, he says you're gonna play this role. You're gonna be like, in Pharaoh's eyes, you're gonna be like a deity because you're the one dispensing the revelation, as it were, to your brother Aaron. And Aaron will be your prophet, and then Aaron will do things, and say things to Pharaoh. So that's all that's going on here. It's just a point of analogy. And it was something that God telegraphed back in Exodus 4 when Moses just didn't want to go to Egypt. So God has to bring Aaron into the picture, again, as this intermediary figure, this spokesperson sort of figure. That's all that's going on here. So we don't need to, complicate it and say silly stuff. It is really, what I'm trying to say here. Now let's go down to verse 3. And verse 3 again is where we get this line about God saying, "I will harden Pharaoh's heart. And though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you." That's verses 3 and 4. Now, we've already, hinted at this because the phrase, about hardening, shows up in other places. And I had said, we'll get to it. And this is the point that we want to camp on the whole issue. And I'm going to be referencing an article here. I will put it in the protected folder in case some of you want to read the whole thing. Although I think with this one you can find it just freely accessible online on the internet anyway. But I'll stick it in the protected folder for newsletter subscribers. So the article is by Robert Chisholm. That's Chisholm, and it's entitled "Divine Hardening in the Old Testament." And it's Dallas Seminary's journal, Bibliotheca Sacra, 153, that's 1996, pages 410 through 434. And the whole article is not just on the Exodus passage, it's on some other Old Testament instances where we get the same language, but we're basically going to just focus on Pharaoh here because we're doing this through Exodus. So Chisholm writes at the beginning of his article, he sort of sets the whole subject up this way. So Chisholm writes in his introduction, "The Old Testament sometimes pictures God as hardening the human heart or spirit. The plague narratives recorded in the book of Exodus attribute Pharaoh's obstinance, at least in part, to divine hardening. Deuteronomy 2:30 and Joshua 11:20 speak of divine hardening in the context of Israel's conquest of the Promised Land, and Isaiah 6:9 through 10 and 63:17 seem to indicate that God hardened his own covenant people." Just to stop here for a second, you can see there Chisholm loops in some other examples of hardening. But for our use of his article, we're going to focus obviously on the Exodus material. But we may return to Isaiah 6, 9, and 10 before we're all done, though, because I think that there's something in that passage worth mentioning, again, if I remember it. Back to Chisholm. "These passages disturb many people, for they raise questions about God's fairness and goodness. Why would God cause someone to resist his will and then hold that person accountable for the sin he prompted? In an effort to preserve human moral responsibility and to avoid the conclusion that God would override the human will or manipulate free moral agents like puppets, some argue that the objects of divine hardening first hardened themselves. Others say the biblical statements, because they reflect ancient Hebrew idiom, cannot be taken at face value. According to this latter explanation, the biblical text replaces the immediate agent, the individual, with the ultimate agent, God. God simply allowed individuals to resist his will, but the Old Testament idiom bypasses the human subject and describes what God allowed as if he actually initiated and directly caused the action. A close reading of the text, a reading that includes being sensitive to literary features and genre considerations, allows one, however, to give the biblical references to divine hardening their full force, while preserving human moral responsibility. Divine hardening took either a direct form in which God supernaturally overrode the human will, and I'll just break in here again. To me, overrode is a bit too strong, but again, we'll just go with what Chisholm says for this point. So divine hardening took either a direct form in which God supernaturally overrode the human will, or an indirect form in which he used intermediate causes to harden the object. Whether accomplished directly or indirectly, this hardening was an element of divine judgment whereby God exhibited his justice and sovereignty. The objects of such judgment were never morally righteous or neutral, but were rebels against God's authority. Divine hardening was never arbitrarily implemented, but was in response to rejection of God's authoritative word or standards. So that's the end of Chisholm's introduction. And again, for our purposes, we're going to be sticking with what he, where he focuses on Exodus, which is most of the article. Again, if you want the article, you can either find it online, or again, if you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll find it in the protected folder. So the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, sort of runs the gamut. It actually runs the spectrum of causalities, direct and indirect, to use Chisholm's terminology. And he, in his article, breaks down the data of the book of Exodus into three categories. So I'll give you these three categories. His category A is a group of texts in which Yahweh is the subject of the verb, or some verb of hardening. Okay, and there's 10 of these. So this is 10 times you have texts in which Yahweh is the subject of some verb of hardening. So in other words, God is the agent. He is the one performing the action. So there's 10 of those. And then his category B are texts in which Pharaoh is or at least a subject of a verb of hardening. So that's 3 times. So there's 3 instances where Pharaoh is the one doing the hardening. At least, one of the subjects. There's one in Exodus 9:34 that says he and his officials hardened their hearts. So that's why we're wording it the way we are. So there's 3 of those, 3 instances. And then lastly, Chisholm has a category C, in which no source or agent is specifically mentioned, and there's 6 of these. So this would be verses like, Pharaoh's heart was hard. Well, that doesn't really tell you who's doing the hardening. Is it Pharaoh or is it God or something? It just doesn't say. So there's 6 of those that are just sort of neutral. Now, Chisholm notes that Driver, in his sort of old classic commentary on the book of Exodus, suggested that in Hebrew idiom, God hardened Pharaoh. So Driver's one of these writers that sort of angles for some idiomatic language here. And what he writes here, quoting Driver, I'm actually going to quote Driver here. Driver believes that God hardened Pharaoh insofar as he, Pharaoh, hardened himself. But even supposing that the passages mean more than this, we must remember that, especially in his dealings with moral agents, God cannot be properly thought of as acting arbitrarily. He only hardens those who begin by hardening themselves. Pharaoh was a self-willed, obstinate man who persistently hardens himself against God and resists all warnings. God thus hardens him only because he first hardened himself. Now, that's the end of the Driver quote. There's a couple important things in there. There's this notion that God doesn't act arbitrarily, which of course Chisholm said as well. And then, this, again, with Driver's following the trajectory where God hardens people who had already begun to harden themselves. Now, I think this is really important and really worth consideration, but you will not find this point if you only look at verbs of hardening in the book of Exodus. That's an important distinction. I think Chisholm, I'll be honest with you, there are places in his article where he seems to latch on to that, and there are other places where he seems, I think, a bit too fixated on the hardening vocabulary. And maybe, I don't know, I don't want to say that he misses it. He doesn't miss it, but I think the way he sort of crafts his article doesn't allow people to see this as clearly as I think they ought to. So this trajectory is one we're going to follow here ultimately about Pharaoh being, like Driver says, a self-willed, obstinate man who persistently hardens himself against God. Chisholm has a footnote at this Driver quote where he says this: Driver correctly affirms that God would not arbitrarily cause someone to disobey him. And he rightly observes that Pharaoh was obstinate from the outset. It is also true that Pharaoh's obstinance prompted divine hardening. However, Chisholm writes, Driver downplays Yahweh's sovereign involvement in the drama and fails to note that hardening terminology is used primarily of Yahweh's acts, not Pharaoh's, and that the divine hardening both precedes and follows that of Pharaoh. So let me try to look at this in a bit of a different way. Again, we've seen what Driver says, and I think Driver is onto something. Chisholm again responded to that. I think he's trying to be fair, but again, I think that Chisholm is a little too fixated on the hardening vocabulary. So let's try to sort of capture a little bit about the chronology of the hardening, because this is going to be sort of where Chisholm tracks on, how he essentially thinks that Driver is downplaying things, downplaying God's role. So if you actually look at Chisholm's list, and again, you can look at the article. He has, again, these three categories we just talked about, and you could use those three categories to sort of reconstruct a chronology. As far as a chronology goes, you have the first occurrence of a verb of hardening in the book of Exodus, back in Exodus 4:21. So let me read that to you. The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I put in your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. So this is part of the burning bush episode. God tells Moses what's going to happen. God, of course, can see into the future. When Moses and Aaron are going to go, talk to Pharaoh, God is, just telling them, here's the outcome. Okay, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. Now, we get, in the chapter we're in today, Exodus 7, verse 3, we get hardening language. We get hardening language in verse 13 and verse 14, verse 22, because this, it starts to kick up here. But Moses and Aaron have actually talked to Pharaoh already, and their conversation with Pharaoh was subsequent to, obviously, the conversation Moses has with God in Exodus 4:21. And I want to try to help you understand sort of how I come down closer to Driver than I do to Chisholm, even though they're very close, actually. But I think that kind of the way that Chisholm wants to emphasize God's role, and then he looks at Driver as de-emphasizing God's role. To me, there's a fundamental question here. When God tells Moses in the burning bush episode, he says, now, look, I'm going to send you to Egypt. You're going to have a conversation with Pharaoh, and I will harden his heart. Does that mean that in that scene, when Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh, that when Pharaoh rejects their request, it's at that moment that Pharaoh's heart becomes hard? And it's sort of a fulfillment of what God said to Moses at the burning bush episode. Is that how we're supposed to read it? Now, if you read it that way, then it's like there's Pharaoh just, kind of doing what Pharaohs do, and Moses and Aaron shows up. He says, hey, what do you guys want? And they say, well, we've met with Yahweh, and Yahweh wants you to let the Israelites go. And then boom, God steps in, touches Pharaoh's heart, and makes it a heart of stone. And Pharaoh says, forget it. Okay, I think that's really dubious. I think that Pharaoh is that guy from the not from the beginning of this, but for a long, long, long time preceding. I think Pharaoh already has a hardened heart, is already predisposed to listen to God. I think he was predisposed against listening to God before God ever even had a conversation with Moses at Sinai. I do not think we can take Exodus 4:21 as sort of a prophecy and then view its fulfillment in their first conversation, which is actually Exodus 5. Let me just read it to you here. Exodus 5:2. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord? Who's Yahweh, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I don't know Yahweh. Moreover, I will not let Israel go." I don't think that verse, Exodus 5:2, is a fulfillment or the outworking of Exodus 4:21. I think the Pharaoh we see in chapter 5 was that guy years before. So I think Pharaoh, why do I even mention this? I think, to me, it's plain that Pharaoh's heart is what it is long before God ever says to Moses, "You're going to go to Egypt and I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart." So regardless of the chronology of the verbs, okay, the verbs of hardening, okay, and this is where Chisholm is at. He's doing this chronology thing. I think that sort of skips or doesn't pay enough attention to the kind of person that Pharaoh already was. As Pharaoh, he thinks he is the Horus incarnate. Of course he's not going to listen to Yahweh. He's been taught this since he was a kid. Okay, when you get on the throne, you're a deity. I mean, you're it. You're the one that regulates the Nile. You're the one that does this and that and the other thing. I mean, he doesn't have to wait for this conversation for God to sort of zap him with hardness. So I actually think that the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, that's where it begins. It begins with Pharaoh. I think Driver's correct here. Even though if you want to do a strict chronology of the verbs of hardening in Exodus, the first one comes from God's mouth in Exodus 4:21. Okay, but Pharaoh is already in that condition. Again, I think that is a much more coherent way to look at things, as opposed to up until the time Moses and Aaron got into the throne room and asked Pharaoh to let Israel go. At that moment, God, fulfilled his words of Exodus 4:21, and so it starts with God. I think that is a very poor reading of what's going on here. And I'm not saying Chisholm does that. I'm saying that the way Chisholm sort of articulates what he's doing with the verbs, again, and then the verbal chronology and the categories, I think that Pharaoh's condition, who he was, it's harder to see it because Chisholm doesn't really ask you to think those thoughts. He doesn't really sort of bring it to the fore as forcefully as he could. Again, that's just my opinion, even though I think the article is really quite good. I just think that we need to be reminded of who this guy was and not just get fixated on verbs and where they fall, if I could say it that way. So Chisholm actually says elsewhere, in the article, where I do think he is mentally tracking on this. But again, I don't think the article just brings it to the fore, to the forefront like it really ought to. But elsewhere in his article, he makes comments that indicate that what was in play was a lot wider, than again the chronology of the verbs. There's just other things going on. So I don't think he's lost this. I just wish the article would bring it out a little bit more. So he writes this in regard to in his section about literary analysis. He says, the narrative does not resolve the tension at this point, again, when we're having the conversations between Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh. But one suspects that the Lord's agenda included more than just saving his people from slavery. So what Chisholm is going to do here is he's going to go into a literary analysis that I recommend you get the article and look at this, because it really is worth looking at, where he shows how these narratives, the sections of the book of Exodus with, leading up to the plagues and then with the plagues, how there's just a little bit more going on than Yahweh versus Pharaoh in this whole matter of hardening. There's a little bit more going on than just saving Israel from Egypt, just getting them out of there. It's just bigger than that. So back to Chisholm, he says, it's revealed later that when God wanted to display his power to the watching world so that all observers, including the Israelites and the Egyptians, might recognize that he is indeed Yahweh. It's Exodus 6:7, 7:5, 9:16, 10 verses 1 and 2, chapter 11 verse 9, 14:4. You get this notion that God is doing what he's doing, not just to extract Israel, not just to win a debate or battle with Pharaoh, he's doing what he's doing, and part of that is the hardening, stringing out Pharaoh's obstinacy. God is doing that not because he wants to play Pharaoh puppet, okay? God is doing that so that the episode cumulatively becomes more dramatic, so that news, the sort of all of the events therein spread far and wide. And so his reputation, God's own reputation, will expand well beyond Egypt and well beyond the Hebrews. He's doing this for the whole world to see, in effect. That's why the Exodus narrative, as it's laid out, this becomes apparent, as Chisholm's article shows you, that Pharaoh's getting hardened and strung along just to make it bigger, just to make it more spectacular, just to, again, so that God can not only prove his case that he's bigger and badder than Pharaoh, but to do it on such a scale that people for miles and miles hear about it. It's to overly dramatize the whole thing. And we know that this actually happened, because when Joshua gets into Jericho, Rahab tells him, we heard what went on in Egypt. I mean, good grief, we know that we're not going to be able to stand up to you, and so on and so forth. So what happens in Egypt does get spread abroad. Again, that wouldn't have happened if Pharaoh would have yielded at the first plague. When he sees the Nile turn to blood, he's like, oh, okay, we're done here, you can go. No, it has to get to the level of the death of the firstborn and the parting of the Red Sea and all that stuff, so that people outside of Egypt hear what happened. And again, God is magnified through this. So again, if you want to look at Chisholm's article, if you're interested in how the narrative itself sort of builds this idea, sort of reaches this crescendo. And I read you the string of verses there that Chisholm has in that little paragraph about God wanting to display his power. That line, or some line thereof, about God wanting to be magnified, and so he strings Pharaoh out again. God basically says, well, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart again, so that we do something else here. That whole stringing along process gets sort of, those statements get seeded throughout the narrative, and it actually builds to a climax. It's very intelligently done, sort of to capture, this building drama, and it's all for the sake of God's, wanting to be known, as Yahweh, the God of all the earth, outside Egypt. So a quick capitulation does not accomplish that. A lengthy, drawn-out drama with a final cataclysmic capitulation and then a final deliverance at the Red Sea, that'll do the trick. News of that will travel. And so that's, again, part of this whole picture. So it's a lot wider than just trying to get Israel out of Egypt and get the people relief, and then, show Pharaoh, put him in his place and all that sort of stuff. It's a little bit bigger stage than that. Now, having said all that, I would say, as we think about this, again, I've already telegraphed, where I'm at on this. I think Pharaoh was just as Driver described. He's that guy. He is the rebellious, he is the hard-hearted, he is the disobedient, he is the obstinate person. He is, long before God ever has a conversation with Moses at the burning bush. The hardness is already resident in Pharaoh before God ever says to Moses, I'm going to send you to Egypt, and this is what's going to happen. You're going to do miracles there. I'm going to wield my power through you, but I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And again, he doesn't just spill the beans as to why he's doing this to Moses. Again, this whole notion of stringing Pharaoh out so that his reputation can expand beyond the borders of Egypt. He doesn't, tell Moses that in one fell swoop. But the point is that God doesn't pick an innocent guy. He doesn't pick a neutral guy. He doesn't pick a guy that, I'll listen to reason. Let me, give me a few days and I'll think about letting Israel. But no, God does not pick someone that would have made a different decision. God already knows what Pharaoh's decision is going to be, because he already knows who Pharaoh is long before he ever converses with Moses at the burning bush. So I think it's really wrong-headed and frankly incoherent to say that God just sort of changed this person's heart to make it hard. He didn't. His heart was already there. And God is doing what he's doing to magnify himself beyond the borders of Egypt. So I would say we have the real questions that we need to sort of be thinking about when we read, through the hardening passages all the way back to Exodus 5. We're here in Exodus 7, and as we proceed forward. I think the real things to think about are these. So I'll just number them. Number one, is Pharaoh's response in Exodus 5:2 the outworking of God's statement in Exodus 4:21? And I've already said I don't think it is. But again, just to talk about this a little bit more. Is the response in 5, I don't know who Yahweh is. Who's that? Okay. Is Pharaoh's response the outworking of God's statement in Exodus 4:21? Is it God hardening Pharaoh in Exodus 5:21, like right on the spot? Or is that defiance something that has already taken root in Pharaoh's heart? Again, to me, this is obvious. To me, Pharaoh's already that guy. Now, here's what Chisholm says. Again, just to give Chisholm some credit here. When Moses confronted the Egyptian ruler and demanded that he allow Israel to celebrate a festival to Yahweh, Pharaoh answered, "Who is Yahweh, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know Yahweh, and I will not let Israel go." Does this response mean the divine hardening had already begun? Now, see, it's a little hard to know what Chisholm means by that, already begun. Now, does he mean to ask, does this response mean that the divine hardening was beginning now? Is that what he means? Or when he says already begun, does it mean like Pharaoh's already that guy? It's actually not clear to me in Chisholm's article which one of those he means. I'm just going to read it for you and let you sort of chew on it. Again, if you want to get the article, you can. So he says, does this response mean the divine hardening had already begun? Whatever that means. Probably not, Chisholm says. 6 times after this, 9:12, Exodus 10:1, 10:20, 10:27, 11:10, 14:8, the narrative notes that Yahweh had hardened Pharaoh's heart. In 9:12, allusion is made to Exodus 4:21. 4 other times, Exodus 7:13 and 22, 8:19 and 9:35, the observation is made that Pharaoh's heart was hard, and this condition is attributed to Yahweh by alluding back to 4:21 and 7:3, and also 8:15. However, 5:2 makes no mention of God's involvement, and that's true. So it is better, Chisholm says, to view Pharaoh's action as autonomous. Again, I still don't like the wording of that. Again, what does that mean, autonomous? Okay, it means that God isn't causing it there. I get that. But I'd still like it to be clear that Pharaoh's deciding what he decides because he's just that guy. And he's been that way. His heart has been hardened, or his own opinion of himself has been so bloated for years. Again, I just wish it was stated a little bit differently. Chisholm says, furthermore, Exodus 4:21 clearly relates divine hardening to the signs Moses would perform before Pharaoh. That's true. It relates them, whatever that means. Again, it all that's happening here is it sets the scene. It doesn't track on the reality that Pharaoh has been who Pharaoh is for a very long time. Again, I hope you're just getting. I keep repeating it, but I want to repeat it for emphasis. I just don't think we can lose sight of that Pharaoh wasn't neutral. Okay, his heart is hard before Moses and Aaron ever show up, before God has ever had a conversation with Moses. This is who he is. Now, again, I think Chisholm is sort of tracking on this, but again, I wish the wording was a bit different, but there you go. I mean, you can get the article and read through it yourself. It's just if I were the journal editor, I would have said, well, can you throw something in here or change the wording here if this is what you mean as opposed to that. I just wish it was a little bit different, so it was a little bit clearer, at least to me anyway. Number 2, again, things that we need to think about, is the allegedly deterministic language. This is the language where Yahweh is the one doing the hardening, okay? is the allegedly deterministic language direct or indirect? That is Yahweh creating an emotional, psychological, and spiritual condition in Pharaoh? Or is he steering the circumstances for Pharaoh, knowing that defiance has already taken root in Pharaoh's heart? So you can have Yahweh be the agent of the verb either way. It just depends, what do you mean? And I think people, when they see God as the subject of hardening verbs, they assume the former, that God is creating an emotional, psychological, spiritual condition in Pharaoh or in a person. We don't have to read it that way at all. God is the agent, sure, but maybe what's meant is that God is steering the circumstances so that this individual that God knows really well is going to choose to do X and not Y, because God knows what the response is going to be in this set of circumstances that God, is creating. Those are two different things. The former is quite deterministic. The latter is not. The latter is God acting on his wisdom to put a free will agent in a situation where God knows what the outcome here is going to be, because he knows that person. He already knows the condition of their heart. He isn't giving them the condition of the heart, the hardening. He already knows who they are. Those are quite different things. And again, I just think we need to stop a moment and think about how God can be the agent of the hardening, but it can actually go in two different directions. It doesn't have to go in one direction. Now, this is beyond the scope of Chisholm's article, to be honest. I just think this is something we, as students, need to think about. After all, the first two chapters of Exodus make it clear that the Egyptians are hostile toward the Israelites. But there's a wild card here. I don't want to miss this verse. In Psalm 105:25, let me just read you that. It says that God, he turned their hearts, the Egyptians, to hate his people, to deal craftily with his servants. It was God who instigated the hostility of the Egyptians against the Israelites, his own people. You say, well, isn't that deterministic? Well, you could read it that way. You could also read it this way. Just for example, God sees what's going on in Egypt. He sees his people multiply. He knows that the Egyptians feel very threatened by this. Okay, but God continues to bless his people, knowing that as they grow, as they multiply, as they become a people in Egypt, that is going to instigate the Egyptians to be hostile toward them. But nevertheless, God is doing that. Why? Because God is creating a set of circumstances where the behavior of the Pharaoh, the guy sitting on the throne in Egypt, is going to be quite predictable. It's not that the guy sitting on the throne is like, man, I love these Israelites, and boy, I love their babies. They're just wonderful people, and all of a sudden, he just turns on a dime, like God again has to touch him and turn his like of the Israelites into fear. It doesn't just happen on a dime. It doesn't just turn that way. But this is the impression, I think, that deterministic thinking often sort of puts in our heads when we read certain passages. We sort of assume that circumstances just change, click, like that. And when they change like that, it was because God pushed a button in heaven that says, okay, now I want all the Egyptians to hate the Israelites. There's the button, right there. I can get them all with one button. Like it's not a natural thing that develops over time, just as a result of very human propensities. I mean, this behavior is very human. We don't need God to push a button, okay, and make human behavior sort of turn contrary or turn in a totally different direction than what it would naturally go to anyway, given the set of circumstances. But God, nevertheless, again, is behind the scene. Again, he's the unseen hand in all of this. This is providence. God is blessing his people in Egypt. They're multiplying. And God knows the Egyptians well enough. He knows human behavior well enough to know that this is going to be at some point perceived as a threat. God doesn't have to sit up in heaven and say, hey, hand me the perceived threat button. I'm going to push it now, and I'm going to change the hearts of all the Egyptians because they're really my puppets anyway. Again, this is how deterministic thinking really is cartoonish. I'm just going to be blunt here. I think when deterministic thinking takes over passages like this, we don't realize this is actually what we're doing. That everything would just go on fine until God asked, some member of the heavenly host for the panic button. And now I'm going to change all the hearts of the Egyptians. Give me the button. Click. There we go. No, what you see happening in the book of Exodus is very human. Okay, you're the people in control. It's your country. Okay, you're an Egyptian. It's your country. And these people in the Delta are just starting to get really large numerically. And you start to wonder where their loyalty might be. Okay, because you have an empire. And when you have an empire, you know that people are out to undo it. People are going to act in self-interest. Well, I mean, we've got masses of people up here in the Delta. What happens if one day they just decide, we don't want to do these jobs anymore? Again, these are very human impulses in very human circumstances with very predictable human propensities and behaviors and thought patterns. You don't need to make God look like a puppet master to understand Exodus 1 and Exodus 2. But again, this is what we get. We get hardening language, and we strip the humanity right out of it. These people are humans. We almost have to make them less than human and again have God pushing buttons to sort of parse the passages. And what I'm suggesting to you is you don't need to do any of that. You don't need to turn God into a puppet master to understand what's going on in Exodus 1 and 2. And God is still in it. Psalm 105:25 says God is still in it. Okay, God knows that by continuing to multiply his people in Egypt, he knows at some point, because he knows humanity very well, at some point they're going to turn. He doesn't need to turn them. They're just going to do it because it's a human thing to do. And at that point, God is going to see that, and he's going to raise up someone called Moses, and he's going to act because God has deemed it is now time. It wasn't before. It is now time to judge the gods of Egypt and to judge Pharaoh. He thinks he's one of these gods, okay? It's now time to judge. See, God gets to decide when he will intervene and judge evil. God gets to do that because he's God. And that brings us to the third thought, again, to think. Is God allowed to directly harden someone for the purpose of judgment? I mean, let's say that I'm not suggesting that the hardening starts, with God. I've already told you I don't think it does. I think Pharaoh's just that guy. But if God wants to string Pharaoh out, okay, is God allowed to do that? Again, it's kind of a dumb question. Of course, God's allowed to do that because he's God. But just think with me here. Is God allowed to harden someone for the purpose of judgment? Why would we conclude that the person being hardened and becoming sort of the focus of God's judgment activity, why would we conclude that the person, in that scenario wasn't already there, wasn't already hard? Why would we conclude that? Well, because, again, we're taught to think deterministically in some context. That's why. Why not say that God knows this person, Pharaoh, and the person deserves the hardening? He deserves to get strung along. Perhaps he would relent after one plague or two plagues. Okay, God decides, no, I'm now going to step in and I'm going to harden him. He's already been hard. And again, he's been this guy for decades. We all know who this dude is. But now I'm going to string him along because I not only want to judge evil, I have not only decided now is the time to judge this guy and his wickedness and the gods of Egypt along with him, because the plagues are going to be aimed at the gods. Okay, I'm not only going to do that, but I want to do it in such a way that people for miles around hear about it. we're not going to let this just settle in the borders of Egypt. We're going to take this fight and magnify it. And to do that, I'm going to harden this guy. I'm going to make him resist now. Is God allowed to do that? We can also even ask, can we presume, or might we presume, that God knows when a person has crossed a line? In other words, God knows Pharaoh. It would actually take a divine intervention. It would actually take God changing Pharaoh from a free will agent to like shutting off his freedom, turning him into a robot for a few seconds to get him to move the other way and repent. Again, God is not going to do that. We've already had a lot of these conversations like in Unseen Realm and some of these other things. God is not going to step in and trample on a person's free will, because if he did, that person would no longer be an imager of God. The image of God, being an imager of God, is a complete package. We do not get to say, well, yeah, imaging is a status, and to accomplish this status, God shares his attributes with us. And he shares all of his attributes with us except freedom. Because if we let people have human free will, then that ruins our theological system. So we're gonna like pull that one out. You can't do that, because you can't parcel out God's own attributes. God is the complete package. When he shares his attributes with his intelligent creatures, whether it's supernatural beings or us. And again, we have them to a lesser degree. We have life, we have, ability, we have power, we have the ability to think, we have self-awareness, all these things. Okay, these are part and parcel attributes of God. When God shares his abilities with his intelligent beings who are like him, so that we can function as him, as it were, in his place. We can image him. We imitate him. That requires thinking. It requires free will decision making. It requires certain abilities, creative abilities, to do things. Okay, we can't just say we're pulling the free will out of that, because then God wouldn't. It's actually an indispensable attribute, because otherwise we would not truly be like God. God is not a robot. Neither are we. Neither are the members of God's spiritual world, who are also like him. And I realize it's convenient to withdraw free will for the sake of a theological system. I'm not interested in theological systems. And this is one of the reasons why. I think it's cheating. So, God is not going to go to Pharaoh and dispense with his free will or shut it off for a few seconds, either way to get him to do something. God is going to be setting circumstances, knowing if a person has crossed the line. I mean, there is a sin unto death, folks. Okay, the New Testament actually does talk about this. There is a point when God will act, and there's no longer the ability to turn around and go the other way. Okay, if God knows that in the New Testament, in 1 John, it has nothing to do with salvation. It just means that you can't turn from your course. This is a sin now that is going to be, you're either going to do something self-destructive and you're going to die, or God's going to step in and judge you, or whatever. There is a point when God knows there is a point of no return for that person. God knows these things. Okay, so we have to give this latitude that God possesses. We have to let him have it. We have to let him be who he is. And what he's not going to do is turn people into puppets, now and then, just to cheat, just to game the system. What he is going to do is he's going to engineer and steer circumstances. And people are going to react the way people do predictably. And some people have just already sailed. I mean, that ship has already sailed for them. That is who they are now. And I think Pharaoh, again, with his hardness, his bloated sense of his own divinity, and his hardness against other gods, and basically anything that would lessen his own glory. This is who he is. This is who he is. So I don't think we can really coherently say God is doing something against Pharaoh's will. It's quite in concert with Pharaoh's will, what's going on here. And again, God is creating the set of circumstances with his own people, knowing that his own people are going to suffer, as things start to turn, but this is God's mechanism. to, again, call Moses, to send Moses back to Egypt and to judge the wickedness of the Egyptians. Could God step in and make sure that none of the righteous ever suffer? That's like asking, could God do something where no one ever suffers today, and there is no evil? Yeah, he could. He could just wipe everybody out, or turn them all into robots, and then turn off the electricity, and there we go. God doesn't do that. Again, he has made us who we are. We are like him. And God essentially plays within the sandbox that God has created for himself. Because to change the rules would be to sort of admit a boo-boo, or I must have lacked wisdom here. I would have made the sandbox differently. No, God is going to operate within the parameters that God himself has set up in creating us as we are, creating humanity as humanity is. And God is big enough, again, to get the job done. And we need to trust him, and knowing that he's not just going to shut off people's free will. People will suffer. The innocent will suffer. The righteous will suffer. But again, if we're believers, this world is not our home. We have to trust the sovereignty of God, that God knows what he's doing. He is steering all things to the end to which he wants everything to go. And in the end, the redeemed, will be blessed, maybe not in this life, but in the life to come. I mean, this is just all big theological stuff. And it's actually all consistent. It does work coherently together, even though it's not always comfortable. What we want is we want biblical theology to work out where we're always comfortable, where we never suffer, we never have pain and things like this. Okay, we live in a fallen world. That's not going to be the way it works. And the only way it can work a different way is for God to undo the image, make us into something we're not, to reverse what he's already done, and then God admits, I made a huge mistake. I mean, again, we have to be theologically consistent. We have to, again, trust God, that things are going to operate the way he has intended them to operate. Ultimately, the outcome, he's going to get the outcome he wants, but he has to play within the parameters that he himself has created. And I've lectured about this a lot of times, that God deemed this preferable than to creating robots, because robots can't, there is no free will there. There's that's not the only thing you lose. You lose love. Okay, it can't be genuine if you're a robot. You lose an awful lot the other way. But what comes with it is, again, the propensity for evil, because all of God's free will beings, all of his imagers, we may be like him, but we are not him. We lack his perfect nature. We are lesser, and it's just not going to work out perfectly because we are not perfect. And again, God knows this, but he deems that preferable than to not having us at all. So again, this is big picture theological stuff. Again, I've lectured a lot, on this kind of thing out on YouTube, so I'm sort of sorry for the rabbit trail here, but I think it's essential that when we look at hardening, it's still the same picture. We do not have to look at the text and be driven to God being a puppet master now. It doesn't have to work that way. And in fact, I think in Pharaoh's particular instance, that's really incoherent, because God isn't changing him. He is who he is. And God is steering circumstances to exploit Pharaoh's own hardness, his own condition. And yes, God does harden him to string him out for God's own purposes. And so one of the questions is God allowed to do that? He's God. He can judge evil in any way he wants to judge it. And this is how it worked out with Pharaoh. Another thought. Must we take a direct view of God's hardening as indicative of how God works in every instance, in every person who does not believe or who does not obey? Again, that is deterministic thinking, and it's silly. Think about it. Again, I don't want to, I do want to pick on systems, but I'm not going to call any particular systems out here. But there is a propensity to take what God does in one case, Pharaoh, and say, well, this is what God does everywhere. This is what God does in the heart of every person who doesn't believe. God makes them not believe. He makes them so they can't believe. In other words, we take this one instance, and again, I think, ignoring the earlier context of who Pharaoh is, but for the sake of the discussion, we look at God doing something with one guy, and then we assume that it works this way. God does it this way with every last person who's ever lived. Why? Why do we make that jump? Okay, do you realize if you're in this group, if you have this theological bent, that yes, I'm going to use this verse and I'm going to extrapolate it to all humanity. Anybody who doesn't believe couldn't ever believe, because God had already, decided that, and God turns every heart one way or the other way, and that person can't resist. They don't have real free. Okay, if that's what you're going to do, then realize what you've done. Good luck with people who are really thinking about this under your care or in your church, because then you can have someone say, well, I wouldn't have cheated on my wife if God had intervened in my heart and taken my lust away. But God didn't intervene in my heart and take my lust away. So I had to cheat on my wife, didn't I? Really? See, then you're going to have people who want to say, yep, that's true, but we're still going to, then they're going to make some stand on the head argument about you're still morally responsible. Look, if the person can't do anything else, I know you can construct an argument that somehow, in some convoluted way, makes the person morally responsible. But that is sophistry. That's what that is. It's sophistry. And that might sound harsh, but I really believe that's what that is. Because you don't want people to apply your own system in other ways. And so you have to find escape valves. You have to build escape valves into your system. And that's the problem. Okay, we need to get away from systems that need escape valves and so on and so forth, and try to look at how God can be the ultimate agent behind things without, the deterministic thinking. This is just the way a lot of people within the evangelical world think, and they really don't want people to apply their own thinking, their own system in all sorts of ways. But they could, and they would be consistent in their application. It's just a shame. Let me look at two other passages real quickly before we wrap up here. I think passages like Judges 14:4, and of course the old familiar one in 1 Kings 22 kind of help here. Let's take the 1 Kings 22 instance because that's the most familiar. If divine counsel stuff, this is Micaiah's vision, with Ahab, where God has decided it's time for Ahab to die, and the prophet has this vision of what's going on in heaven. God is having a divine council meeting, and the spirits there, the heavenly host, who are called spirits in the passage, are debating. One says one thing, another says another, because God has let them participate in the decision of how Ahab is going to die. We already know Ahab's going to get judged, but God says, okay, how do we want to do this? He lets them participate. So one spirit steps forward and says, I got it. I'll be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets. That'll get Ahab to go up to remote Gilead, and then he'll bite the dust there. Okay. So God says, you're going to succeed. Go out and do that. So God allows, again, in this case, free will beings of his heavenly host to participate in a decision. God knows that the right set of circumstances are created, and Ahab will behave predictably. And God will use that set of circumstances and Ahab's predictable behavior to judge Ahab. Okay? Judges 14:4. This is Samson. It's a little less familiar. I'll just start at the first verse. Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. Basically, that's who I want. She's pretty hot. Okay. And then verse 4, we have this. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he, the Lord, was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. Now, it was from the Lord. If you're the deterministic, God made Samson choose a wife outside of the Israelites. So God made Samson sin, and he did that so that God could justify beating up on the Philistines. And Samson couldn't do any other choice because there's no such thing as real free will. So God made Samson sin, and we know that for sure because Samson could not sin. Okay? It was from the Lord. Why can't we say, God knows Samson really well? He knows how Samson's mind works. Okay? Why can't we have God behind the circumstances of Samson's little trip to Timnah and behind the circumstances of Samson laying eyes on this babe, okay, knowing what Samson's going to do and how that is going to, again, be another little wheel behind a whole set of other circumstances. The wheels are going to start turning, and God is going to use Samson's own decision in a specific set of circumstances to judge not only the Philistines, but to judge Samson too. Because Samson suffers, for his own decisions. He reaps what he sows, but ultimately to judge the Philistines and deliver his people from the Philistines. Why can't we have God, again, behind the scenes, steering circumstances in accord with the propensities of human behavior, which God knows really, really well? And again, God knows Samson is not innocent, okay, here. Samson has chosen a path. Samson has made a series of bad, flawed decisions. Samson's character has been formed by Samson, okay? And God knows all this very well. God can still be in charge of what's going on without going down an absurd and I think, frankly, self-contradictory, theologically contradictory, deterministic trajectory. See, again, this is part of the problem. If for those committed to a deterministic view, they seem to assume that God can't be in charge of things without one-to-one direct causation. And I would submit to you that God can be in charge. God will have his way. He doesn't need to shut off, flip switches. Today you have free will except for a few seconds because I need you to do that. God doesn't need to do that. He will get his way in the end, one way or the other. But again, we sort of assume certain things about how this would work. And I'm just trying to get you to think about, well, do we really need to go down this road when there's this other road over here that might, work just fine, okay? So by way of summary, this is sort of the way, I just approach the whole subject. When God does things, he doesn't do things to make things, to shut people's free will off. In the case of the Israelites in Egypt, he doesn't do things just to make things worse for the righteous. I mean, there's a whole set of things going on, and God is putting things into motion. God creates circumstances. He puts circumstances in motion to vindicate or deliver the righteous through the judgment of his and their enemies. And since we live in a fallen world, the righteous will suffer along the way. That will happen because, again, we're living in a fallen world, but the free will imaging box that we talked about earlier. Again, we could ask, why doesn't God just strike the wicked dead? Why doesn't he just clean house? Well, again, to get rid of all evil, we know what he'd have to do. The consistent pattern of Scripture isn't that sort of behavior. Rather, God works through boots on the ground circumstances. He works through people whom he knows will act and behave in certain ways on both sides. This is the interplay of a sovereign mind and free will beings. God steers people via events and relationships, circumstances, those sorts of things. He does things that prompt the need for the person under judgment to make a decision, and then their decision is predictable. One could ask, why doesn't God try to influence people to make a right decision contrary to their ingrained free will propensity? Answer, because God has decided to judge them. God is allowed to judge evil. Okay, he's allowed to judge evil. If we don't honor God's if we don't let God be allowed to judge evil, if we don't honor that, if we don't just live with the fact that God has a right to judge evil, if we expect God to steer everyone toward righteousness and repentance instead of judging evil, then we're saying that we are more moral than God. We're saying God is morally wrong to judge sin. Well, if I was God, I'd give them a chance. How do we know how many chances God already has given a person? God is allowed to judge sin. He is not morally suspect if he decides to judge sin. Again, we just don't know what God has been doing in a person's life, and that person has just shut off, God, that they've chosen their own path. God knows the direction of a person's heart, and if he decides to judge them, he will steer the circumstances toward that end, knowing that a person will follow course. Sometimes, God does do something dramatic to invade a person's life. I mean, that does happen too. And that's up to God, to decide. Like Paul. I mean, he directly encounters Paul on the Damascus Road. But here's a question. On what basis is God obligated to do that for everybody? What's the basis for that? And if you say, well, he is required to do that for everybody, then you've just said God has no right and no authority to judge evil. That's what you've said. The result of all that is a theology that says God isn't allowed to judge wickedness. He is. God has chosen to create free will beings. Again, the whole imaging idea. He's not going to reverse that decision. It's his own decision. He did things that way, else he'd be, incapable of creating an intelligent creature, humanity, that's truly like him. God will therefore use human will to set people up for judgment. That's what we learn in Exodus here with the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. He may intervene dramatically, which would be a special act of grace for his own reasons, but he's not obligated to do that for everybody, because that would mean that God is, again, not allowed to judge evil. Could Paul have refused to obey the call? That's a debate. How about Moses, though? How can we say that Moses could not have disobeyed God's call? Moses tried to disobey God's call. And even after the burning bush, remember, Moses returns to Jethro's house and God meets him again. Remember that? Moses could have said no, but God, and again, stays with him. Does God have to do that? No, God doesn't have to do anything, but he chooses to do that. He even, again, graciously gives Moses a backup visitation after Moses goes back and returns to, Jethro's place. God isn't required to do that kind of stuff for everybody. And not everybody will need it. At any point, we all, think of it this way. We all deserve alienation from God because, of our sin. None of us deserve salvation. God is never in our debt. He may choose to judge. He may not. He knows he knows the circumstances. He knows what is the best thing to do for his own purposes. He is allowed, again, to make either decision. For us to judge God is frankly arrogant. It's hubris in every way. God seeks to persuade people to do this or that. He uses other people, again, as his agents of persuasion. He uses a whole, bunch of other things to create circumstances. But God is allowed to intervene or not at his own discretion. And in Pharaoh's case, Pharaoh already was who he was. God steps in to string him out, again, for God's own purposes. Frankly, we should be grateful that God persisted with each of us in the ways that he did, because he didn't have to. Again, God could have just said, all right, it's time to judge. And a lot of us, God did judge us. He did judge sin, but he didn't do it in sort of a final way. There was no finality toward it. But with some people, that happens. Again, God knows the whole set of circumstances of everyone's life. And again, I think the big lesson here is not to presume, and I'm using that word very deliberately because I think it is quite presumptive. We ought not presume that we need or must go down the path of this total determinism to understand what's going on between God and Pharaoh in these passages? We don't. We don't. So again, just a caution there, and I hope you will, take a look at Chisholm's article. I think it's really worth a look. And again, my only gripe with it is that I think we need to just more intentionally think about where Pharaoh was already at. God is not flipping switches in this guy. He is already who he is. And so we do not need to have a switch flipping deity. We can have a deity, we can have a God who decides to judge and sets up circumstances whereby judgment will happen, and also, in Israel's case, deliverance. God is ultimately in control, but that does not have to mean direct deterministic thinking. All right. Well, like I said, we are going to have an introduction to the plagues here, and that's how I'll start. And then, we'll get into the first plague and how, again, some of the perspectives on the plagues, how that sort of helps us, think about the first one that's in Exodus 7. And we'll do the same thing as we go through the rest of the plagues too. But since we're at Exodus 7, 14 through 25, let me just read that, and then we'll jump into how scholars approach the whole subject of the plagues. So beginning in verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water. Stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that turned into a serpent. And you shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But so far you have not obeyed. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood. The fish in the Nile shall die, and the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, their canals, and their ponds, and all their pools of water, so that they may become blood. And there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, even in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water in the Nile turned into blood, and the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. So the chapter ends with, the plague on the Nile, and then we get, a 7-day interval until we get to the next plague, and we'll hit that next time. But this is one of the plagues, and the majority, are focused specifically on the Egyptians and not on the Hebrews. You'll notice as we read that there's no reference that the Hebrews had this problem as well. That's not going to be true with every plague, but again, for the majority it is. But rather than sort of focus on the minutiae, and we'll come back again to some of the details here in the first plague, I want to start here by talking about how scholars approach the whole topic. And I'm going to be referencing, for the most part, John Currid's book, and I alluded to this in our very first episode, and I think a couple of times in other episodes, but he has written a book called Ancient Egypt and the Old Testament. It's Baker Books. It's not an expensive book. Currid is trained in Egyptology and in Old Testament, so this is a good source for thinking about things in Exodus and also about Egyptian material that occurs in other books. So Currid has a whole section on approaches to the plagues. It's over 15 pages long, so he devotes a good bit of attention to it. And he says, the way he breaks things down, we'll just go with it because he's talking about who thinks about the plagues in what way the most. Okay, so he breaks there are 4 views down. He breaks the 4 views down into 2 and 2. So there are 4 basic approaches to how we might understand the plagues, and the 2 most held, what Currid would call the major positions, we'll start with. So the first one is that the plagues are natural disasters. This is probably among just scholars in general, whether they're evangelical or not. This is probably the majority view. So Currid writes in regard to this, in general, this interpretation, again, that the plagues are natural disasters, attempts to explain the plagues of Egypt as typical natural phenomena of antiquity. Various scholars have tried to prove through textual evidence that similar plagues occurred frequently in the ancient Near East. Currid has a footnote there that I'm going to get to in a moment, but I'll just continue with his quote. He writes that such events occur even today in Egypt has been used to argue for the historicity of the plagues. In addition, this position holds that the order of the plagues was naturally progressive. That is, each plague was a cause or a catalyst of the subsequent plague. They built upon one another. So that's the end of that quotation. And in a footnote, if you're interested in sort of other material as far as the plagues being natural phenomenon, he provides a couple of sources, and I'll just give them to you here. Steiglitz's article, and this is an older article, but it's kind of a standard reference point in Biblical Archaeology Review, Volume 13. This was 1987. He wrote an article called Ancient Records and the Exodus Plagues. For a good summary of this view, you could consult Hoffmeyer's article in Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary, just his entry on plagues in Egypt, and I will be referencing that a bit in this episode. Nahum Sarna, in his book Exploring Exodus, The Heritage of Biblical Israel, has, again, good summaries of this. And David Livingstone, The Plagues and the Exodus. That's in a journal that's fairly obscure to find, Archaeology and Biblical Research, Volume 4, 1991. Now, that one you can find online if you just Google that. So Google Livingstone and then Plagues and Exodus, and you will find a link to that particular article, which is good because that journal's, I don't even think it's published anymore. But again, there you have a good summary. Now, this view, not surprisingly, has a long history. It goes well back into the 19th century, and it kind of gained traction due to the influence of Flinders Petrie, who was a very famous Syro-Palestinian archaeologist, also a very famous Egyptologist. And Currid has a nice summary of sort of Petrie's influence here, and I'll read that. Flinders Petrie popularized the position, and with the publication of his Egypt and Israel, and that was a book, it became the dominant understanding of the plagues. Petrie took the issue a step further by claiming that the plagues were not only a natural sequence, but also the consequences of seasonal changes. In particular, they followed the cycle of the inundation of the Nile River. And at this point, Currid is going to quote from Petrie, and I'll read you Petrie here. The river turned to blood with the fish dying, was the unwholesome stagnant Nile just at the lowest before the inundation, when it is red and swarming with organisms. The Egyptians have to resort to wells and cisterns at this time in the early part of June. Okay, now let me just stop there. This is Petrie writing, and you'll notice at the end of Exodus 7, there was this reference that the Egyptians had to dig along the Nile for water to drink. And you would think, well, wouldn't that be blood too? Because it was blood even in the jugs and the jars and stuff like that. Again, the narrative, the Exodus narrative actually doesn't say whether their digging for water along the Nile was successful or not. But it's interesting that Petrie picks up on this, and he observed the same thing happening in Egypt while he was there on one of his many campaigns during the low point of the Nile, when it turns red because of the soil, and it's you can't drink it. So back to Petrie's quote, the Egyptians have to resort to wells and cisterns at this time in the early part of June. The frogs abound after the inundation has come in July. The plagues of insects, murrain, and boils belong to the hot summer and damp, unwholesome autumn. The hail and rain came in January. This is closely fixed by the effect on the crops. The barley must have been up early for the wheat to be yet hidden or hardly sprouting. This would show that it was planted early in November, in ear by the middle of January, and ripe early in March. The flax has similar seasons, and the wheat is a month later. The locusts come in the spring over the green crops about February. The sandstorms bring a thick darkness that may be felt in March at the break of the hot winds. And the last plague, the death of the firstborn, was at the Exodus in April. The intervals are about a month apart. From the middle of January to mid-April, the time agrees to the months. Now that's from Flinders, Egypt and Israel, which was published in 1911. You notice how he didn't really explain the last plague, and that's going to become an issue. But Currid adds at the end of that quotation, according to Petrie's calculations, then, the plagues upon Egypt were natural events occurring in less than a 12-month period. So again, that view, published in 1911, sort of became the dominant view in scholarship. And you can see where it appears to have some coherence to it, some alignment at least. Again, it has weaknesses, but that quotation from Petrie doesn't really betray them. We'll get to that in a moment. But you can see how this would sound sort of reasonable, okay? Now, the most recent scholarly defense of this view, though, is that of Greta Hort. And this comes from an article that she published in 1957 called The Plagues of Egypt. It's in the journal abbreviated ZAW, the Zeitschrift für Alttestamentliche Wissenschaft. Just put ZAW and you'll probably find it. I don't know if this is going to be available online. Probably isn't. But a summary of her work you would actually find in Hoffmeyer's Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary essay. So if that's a tool, a resource that any reasonable library, any good reference library that includes religion, is going to have that reference source. So you can read it there too, or at least a summary of it. Now, Currid summarizes Greta Hort's work as well. So let me read you his couple paragraphs there. He writes, according to her study, the first 6 plagues clearly reflected the ecosystem of ancient Egypt. Okay, let me just stop there. So she's already sounding like Petrie, but notice that she groups things in the first 6 plagues. Her comments here are the first 6. Okay, just hold that thought. So back to Currid, his summary. The first plague was the result of a high inundation that made the river red with sediment, causing it to look like blood. Concurrent excessive precipitation brought flagellates and their bacteria from mountain lakes and streams, resulting in animal death in the river. The death of the fish polluted the water habitat, a disaster which forced the frogs from the river onto dry land. The frogs then died, and soon thereafter mosquitoes, or lice, and flies multiplied off the dead amphibians. The insects in turn carried disease, probably anthrax, to the land animals and eventually to humans. Plagues 7 through 9 were not related sequentially, but they had in common their origination in the atmosphere. Again, whatever that means. This is Currid's wording. Hort emphasized the naturalistic character of these plagues, detailing frequent similar occurrences in Egypt. The final plague may have been merely a reflection of the high infant mortality rate of ancient Egypt. That's the end of Currid's summary of Hort's view. Again, you can see she's right in the tradition of Petrie, maybe a bit more nuanced in the discussion. Again, this is the dominant view in scholarship, just general scholarship. And not surprisingly, this is the view that is held. This view is mostly held by those who would deny any supernatural causation to the plagues. Though that isn't a truism. I mean, you will find evangelicals who find coherence in this to some extent, but they won't go the full 9 yards and just rule out the supernatural for maybe a couple of them, or they'll weave the supernatural somewhere into the narrative and then use sort of the natural phenomenon that has been witnessed in Egypt as an explanation. So they'll get God in there somewhere, but they don't view the plagues as having sort of a direct divine causation. Maybe death of the firstborn or something like that. There'll be some allowance somewhere. Now, Currid notes again about this whole sort of, who's in what camp. He writes this. He says, those scholars who hold that the plagues were natural disasters are generally of 2 camps. Some believe that the fact that the plagues can be explained as natural phenomena actually serves as confirmation of the supernatural. There are some of those. In other words, if the biblical material detailing the natural phenomena is true, then it follows the entire narrative, including the supernatural elements, is accurate. Let me just stop there. So Currid is saying, some would say, well, look, if the writer got this right, observing natural phenomena, then we have to take him at his word as well when it comes to the supernatural causation. So some are going to try to put God in the narrative that way. Back to Currid, he writes, most interpreters, however, argue that the commonplace occurrence of phenomena akin to the plagues of Egypt actually explains away the miraculous. The divine or theological elements in the text are merely the author's attempt to dress up a simple naturalistic account. Present-day scholars overwhelmingly adhere to the latter position, which I just had noted. Now, on the surface, again, you can look at this, and what Petrie says and what Hort says kind of works, at least for the first six, kind of works reasonably well. But the need for a sequential break for plagues, 7 through 9, is in my view kind of telling. I mean, that exposes a real weakness here. And the death of the firstborn hardly seems explainable by natural disaster or just the general infant mortality rate. The language is just far more specific than that. And I guess to Currid's credit, he's less generous than the way I just summarized that. So I'll just so that you can get a feel for how Currid thinks about this. He writes, the interpretation of the plagues as natural disasters has obvious weaknesses and breaks down under careful scrutiny. First of all, nowhere in the 6 chapters detailing the plagues is there any hint of one plague's having been the source of another plague. Okay, that's important. Only by mere speculation can one argue from the text that the frogs were infected with anthrax. Okay, that's a little shot at Hort. And Currid adds, and only by mere speculation can you argue that the disease was passed on to land animals by lice. And the text doesn't say that. Second, Currid observes, the ecological sequence crumbles after the 6th plague because the hailstones of the 7th plague had no relation to the anthrax of plague 6. In addition, plagues 7 through 9 had no chronological connection with one another, even though there was a conceptual relationship. And the 10th plague had absolutely no link with the previous plagues. Finally, the argument that plagues 1 and 10 were simply natural phenomena is difficult to defend. The theory that the first plague was symbolic, the water did not turn into blood but merely look like it, cannot be supported by the text. In no way does the book of Exodus present that plague as having been metaphorical in nature. Rather, it relates the disaster as direct historical narrative. So that's, a summary of, and I would agree with Currid, his criticisms there. So the natural disaster view, which again is the dominant view, that has the veneer of coherence. It has the veneer of reasonableness that it covers the necessary ground, but it actually doesn't when you sort of probe it a little bit. Now, the second major view or the major approach to the plagues is what Currid and others would call the literary creations view. And again, just to summarize it, this is a little, in terms of its history, it's a little more recent than the natural phenomenon view. You can trace this to the early 20th century. Currid, he does note that this one seems to be getting more and more support as time goes on. The basic idea is that behind each plague is a kernel of history that was dressed up in the telling of the story. In other words, we have mythic history here, but mythic history not being, real history. And again, if you're confused by that terminology, you need to go back to the very first episode that we did introducing the book of Exodus, and I talked about mythic history. I think mythic history is history. And there are a number of reasons why I think it's methodologically flawed to impose our modern sense of history and what we think history requires on ancient texts. And then turn out we hit the end of that road and say, well, the ancient stuff isn't real history. Well, we can't apply the tools of modern historical validation to our own lives. I couldn't write my own biography and have and meet the criteria of modern history, and that, again, just a simple observation like that, tells me that maybe we're just not approaching this the right way. Because I do know my story. I was there. I'm an eyewitness. But nevertheless, I can't meet the criteria, and neither can any of you, to tell my story or your own story. So I think we need to rethink what we're asking for there. But anyway, back to the literary creations view. Basically, the literary creations view is saying, well, there's something that happened here, and then the writer of Exodus is sort of putting a theological spin on it. So scholars who hold this view believe the text, they're on a spectrum here. They're going to believe something is historical in there. They're going to believe something is ahistorical or fabricated in there. It's going to be a mixed bag. So they're going to deny the historicity in some respects, and they're going to try to affirm it in others. Their approach is a literary approach. They're looking at what the author is doing with sort of boots on the ground events, and then trying to sort of judge the result of that literary production as, well, there's something that went on here, but it's theological spin, and chances are good that some of it's basically on target, that hasn't been spun up too much. But then there's going to be other things that are just, he just sort of went off the deep end on his description of this or that. So it's going to be a mixed bag here. Now, there are two other views, and I'll telegraph where I'm at. I like both of these views. I think they work well in tandem together. But we'll take them one at a time. The two other views are, if you're numbering this, number 3, the polemic view, Polemic, the polemic view. And this is the idea that the 10 plagues were directed against specific Egyptian deities. If you want a little bit more source material here, you could get Charles Ailing's book, Egypt and Bible History. It's 1981. It's an older book, but again, Chuck has a lot of Egyptological training, so it's worthwhile. J.J. Davis, Moses and the Gods of Egypt. That's also old, 1986, but again, still worthwhile. And G.A.F. Knight, Theology as Narration. I'm not familiar with that book. I'm familiar with the other two, but that's an Erdman's title. It's even older, 1976. So those would be 3 sort of starting points if you're interested in, pursuing this perspective. But Currid comments on this view. Again, this is the polemic view. And he writes this. He says, there should be no question that the biblical authors understood the plagues in that manner, in other words, as a polemic. The book of Numbers, for example, reports, quote, the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn whom the Lord had struck down among them. The Lord had also executed judgments on their gods, unquote. That's Numbers 33, verse 4. In fact, the plague account itself contains similar wording. Quote, for I will go through the land of Egypt on that night and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord, unquote. That's Exodus 12:12. So Currid says the idea that the disasters that Egypt experienced were a mockery of that land and its customs is unmistakable. The scriptures even use the term mockery. That's the Hebrew term alal for God's judgment upon Egypt. That's in Exodus 10, verse 2. So that's, again, in the narrative portion about the plagues. So again, the polemic view is that plagues are what they are, specifically because they have something to do with judging the gods of Egypt. Now, I'm not going to go into the details at this point. When I'm done summarizing the approaches of the plagues, we're going to hit the first plague, and then I'll apply some of this. And I can, again, I'll just telegraph where I'm headed here. There are polemic elements in the first plague, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But there are also elements, or at least I think the fourth approach, helps us to get a good flavor for what's going on in Exodus as well. And the fourth view is that the plagues are examples of decreation. Now, this is also a literary argument, and this one might be unfamiliar to a lot of you in the audience, but I'll use Currid's explanation for this. He has a nice summary of it. He writes, many scholars have pointed out that Exodus 1 through 15, so the first 15 chapters, owes much of its structure, language, and theology to the Genesis creation account. As Warren Gage states, quote, the Exodus history of the Hexateuch, that's the Pentateuch, 5 books plus the book following, is so structured as to be a redemptive reenactment of creation, unquote. So let me just stop there. So this view is saying that if you look at Exodus 1 through 15 carefully, there are going to be parts of that chunk of Exodus that directly hook back into the creation account in Genesis, and the plagues are part of this. But of course, the plagues would not be about creation. It would be about the reversal of creation, and hence it's called decreation. So Currid writes, in other words, the account of the deliverance of Israel out of the oppression of Egypt through the plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea reflects the narrative of the original creation. Although the creation theme is reflected in many passages of Exodus, we will take time to consider only 3 of them. And then he goes into his book and he talks about how this works in 3 places. So I would say, again, go back to the original episode that began our series on Exodus, and we talk about the relationship of Exodus to Genesis, and that'll give you a little bit of flavor for what we're talking about here. But specifically, again, we'll focus in on the plagues. There are things about the plagues that the way they're described, and even the order and the structure, and so on and so forth, that sort of mimes creation material in Genesis. And so scholars have observed this and thought, why would the author be writing it that way? And so this idea that the plagues are an intentional, not retelling, but detelling of creation. There must be something to that. That must be done for some theological messaging. And again, I think that's a good trajectory. Now, Currid adds a little bit more information by way of examples here. We'll just pick a couple. He writes, the first 5 verses, for instance, show awareness. This is the first 5 verses of Exodus, the whole book. Show awareness of the Genesis tradition of the 70 persons descended from the patriarch Jacob. And that happens in Genesis 46, 26 through 27. Most importantly, the biblical writer describes the Zitzim Laban, that's the life setting of Israel, in terms of the cultural mandate of Genesis 1:28. Quote, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty so that the land was filled with them, unquote. That's Exodus 1:7. And the point is the language there sounds a lot like Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. So scholars look at that and say, well, okay, the writer obviously knows the wording of Genesis, and he's using the wording here to describe something else, so he must be trying to strike a connection. Second example from Currid, the water ordeal Moses underwent is reminiscent of the redemption of Noah in Genesis 6 through 8. After the birth of Moses, his mother Jochebed could not hide him for more than 3 months. So she placed him in a gomeh teva, that's a wicker basket, Exodus 2:3. The first term, gomeh, is an Egyptian word that means papyrus. Teva, an Egyptian word which means chest or coffin, is also used in reference to Noah's Ark, believe it or not. Noah's Ark is called a teva, okay, back in the flood account. One should observe, Currid writes as well, that in Exodus 2:3, Jochebed covers the wicker basket with tar and pitch, just as Noah did the ark, Genesis 6:14. The deliverance of Noah can be viewed as a recreation because God directs the cultural mandate of Genesis 1:28 to Noah and his offspring. Quote, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's Genesis 9:1. That command is the same decree that the Hebrews were fulfilling in Exodus 1 as they multiplied and increased in Egypt. So the deliverance of Israel out of Egypt is being cast by the biblical writer as a recreation. And again, when it comes to the plagues, scholars are going to argue that since that sort of takes the land apart or reverses order, that's like a decreation. And again, we'll get to the point of how that might work theologically when we hit the first plague here in a moment. Finally, Currid writes that the Exodus is a second act of creation is evident in Exodus 13 through 15. The Genesis creation account served as the paradigm for Israel's deliverance at the sea. That is to say, the redemptive creation of Israel at the sea is cast in the same narrative style of original creation, as the pillar of divine presence brings light into darkness, Exodus 13:21. Of course, that corresponds to the first creation day. And as the waters are divided, in Exodus 14:1, think of Genesis 1:6 there, on the second day, and language on the second day. The dry land emerges, Exodus 14:29. That's what happens on the third creation day. In Deuteronomy 32:11, God's tender care of Israel after she had passed through the sea is likened to an eagle's hovering over and protecting its newborn. The Hebrew term rachaf, hovers, used here in Deuteronomy 32:11, also occurs in Genesis 1:2, where the Spirit of God hovered. Okay, it's the same Hebrew verb. And Currid notes those are the only two occurrences of Rachaf in the Pentateuch. He, of course, is correct there, that the biblical author is drawing a parallel between the original creation account and the Exodus narrative is further confirmed by his use of the Hebrew term tohu. Okay, remember in Genesis 1:2, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then, now the earth was tohu vabohu, formless and empty, or, however that gets translated. That's Genesis 1:2. Well, that term is used in Deuteronomy 32:10 to describe the wilderness that they're wandering through, in the Exodus narrative. Currid says he also used, again, the author also used the word to characterize the conditions of the original creation. As with Rachaf, tohu also appears nowhere else in the Pentateuch. So that's the end of Currid's treatment there. Now, if you want to get a fuller glimpse of these correspondences, I'm going to send Trey a PDF file, a chart that is drawn from Currid's book, where he puts a lot of this stuff in chart form, and you can see the parallels, and they're actually pretty interesting. So you could take a look at that. So this view, again, the decreation view, has God in effect demolishing creation order in the same manner that he erected creation order back in Genesis. Why would God do this? Well, to the Hebrew reader, again, the Israelite, reading his Bible or her Bible, the point would be telegraphed that I guess we know now who has sovereign control of the order of creation. It's the God of Israel. And they would be able to see the correspondences in their text. So there's a theological point being made. This is also a big deal with Egypt because of the Egyptian concept of Ma'at. That's M-A-A-T. Now, I've mentioned this before, but the Egyptian of Ma'at is sort of the way things are supposed to be because this is the way that the gods created them to be or intended all things to be. It's a cosmic and an earthly and a social order. It's the order of everything. Everything is the way the gods intend. And it was Pharaoh's job, as the incarnation of Horus, it was his job to maintain that order. That was a specific task in Egyptian religion. So Pharaoh is supposed to maintain Ma'at as it was bestowed on earth by Ra, and of course, the whole pantheon and all this kind of stuff. So Currid describes Ma'at this way. Let me just read his little summary. Ma'at was a result of the first creation, and this is Egyptian theology, and part of the inherent structure of creation. Ma'at held order together. Ma'at, therefore, was the antithesis of chaos. It was a dynamic force not limited to the initial structure of creation, but always necessary because the veracity of the forces of chaos continued to menace the very existence of the created world. Consequently, the Egyptians strove to maintain Ma'at in their earthly existence. Ma'at was not merely an ideal concept removed from daily living, but the model for human behavior. Humans had to struggle to preserve Ma'at and to keep cosmic balance upon the earth. In ancient Egypt, the king had the duty to maintain Ma'at. He was considered the personification of universal order. Thus, in the instruction for King Meri-Ka-Ra, that's an Egyptian text Currid is referencing here, the Pharaoh is advised by his father to, quote, do Ma'at whilst thou endurest upon earth, unquote. Every pharaoh had the obligation to reestablish and reaffirm Ma'at upon accession to the throne. The forces of chaos could upset Ma'at, so at the advent of a new king, order had to be restored. Now, Hoffmeyer, in his Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary article, he notes that this was the point of the plagues, just generally. So again, this will telegraph a little bit where Hoffmeyer's at. And again, I've already told you, I like both the third and fourth view, the polemic view and the decreation view, because the decreation view is a direct attack on Ma'at, the whole Egyptian concept. And it shows that not only Ra and any other Egyptian deity and the Pharaoh, they are not in charge of the order of earth. They're not in charge of the order of the cosmos. They're not in charge of anything, okay? The one who maintains this order And he is going to demonstrate that he is the one who maintains this order by destroying it, okay, by undermining it, by reversing it, to demonstrate that he alone, the God of Israel, namely Yahweh, the one that Pharaoh said, who's this guy? Okay, that is the one deity who is in control and who is master of all these things. So that decreation emphasis, that attack on Ma'at, just generally, and we're going to see it, work out in the first plague and other plagues as well, but just generally, it is decreation, and it's also a pretty effective polemic, against the gods of Egypt. But anyway, Hofmeyr sort of, summarizes this, his view that this is basically the general point. I want to read you what he says in his Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary essay. He writes, "The cumulative effect of the plagues on the Egyptian view of cosmic order and the king's role in maintaining it is a major issue in the plagues. From Dynasty 4 onward," okay, that's the Old Kingdom era, the Pyramid Age, all right? "From Dynasty 4 onward, the Pharaoh bore the title Son of Ra. As such, he was the god of the Egyptian state and was responsible to maintain the cosmic order, Ma'at, on earth that had been established by Ra at creation. Because of the bond that existed between the created order and the king as the incarnate son of Ra, of course he's also the incarnate Horus, he was responsible for the fertility of the land as well as for the proper function of the Nile. And because of the strong bond between the sun god Ra and the king, he was the one who illuminated the two lands. In other words, the upper and lower Egypt, all of Egypt. The vitality of the land was ensured by a number of annual festivals and related rituals over which the king presided. The 9 plagues certainly showed that a cosmic struggle was in progress, and they challenged the king's ability to maintain that cosmic order. If the king failed to execute his duties properly, the land would suffer. In other words, it would be in a state of chaos. The Egyptian term for that is yisfet, which is how Egyptian literature describes the first and second intermediate periods. When a strong king appeared and regained the control of the land, Ma'at was reestablished. Now, it's the end of the first part of the quotation. Hofmeyr is going to go on, and he quotes from the prophecy of Neferti to illustrate Egyptian theology on this point. So I want to read you that excerpt. He's quoting from ancient Egyptian literature, which is an anthology of Egyptian texts here. And this portion of the prophecy of Neferti reads as follows: "Dry is the river of Egypt. One crosses the water on foot. One seeks water for ships to sail on, its course having turned into shoreland. The land is bowed down in distress owing to these feeders, the Asiatics, who roam the land. Foes have risen in the east. Asiatics have come down to Egypt. Ra will withdraw from mankind. Though he will rise at his hour, one will not know when noon has come. No one will discern his shadow. No face will be dazzled by seeing him. Then a king will come from the south, Ameni, the justified, his name. Then order, Ma'at, will return to its seat, while chaos, Yisfet, is driven away." That's Ancient Egyptian Literature, Volume 1. And Volume 1 of that series, by the way, is Old Kingdom. And so right away you're going to read that, Asiatics. Well, didn't Mike say the Asiatic? That was the Egyptian term, for Semitic people. Yeah, it was. So we have a reference to the sun darkening. We have a reference to the Nile drying up. We've got the land in general distress. Those are two elements that's again sound like the plagues, but this takes us back to a little bit. I mean, this is Old Kingdom stuff, so it's pretty old in Volume 1. It takes us back to that chronological disconnect too. There are things in Egyptian literature that sound like the Exodus plagues, but if you want to know why there's a chronological disconnect, I'm not going to go back into that quagmire. You can listen to the earlier episodes on Exodus as we just were starting the series to know what the issues there are. Hofmeyr concludes his selection then after quoting the prophecy of Neferti with this. He says the plagues of Exodus 7 through 10 would have been understood by Pharaoh and the Egyptians as a direct assault on the king, who was responsible for the proper function of the Nile, the crops, and the sun. This could be why the unnamed Pharaoh of the Exodus is so angered by the signs and wonders. They were beyond the limits of his control. Perhaps his continued obstinacy was due to his hoping he could somehow reestablish himself as the Lord of Ma'at. That's end of Hoffmeyer, but obviously that ain't going to happen. So again, the decreation view I think has real value. I think it serves as a polemic just generally, but I still like the third view, the polemic as well, because there are some clear shots aimed directly at specific Egyptian deities. So we're going to transition now into the first plague. Again, I like both views, 3 and 4. To me, they work nicely together. So let's make a few observations about the first plague in Exodus 7:14 through 25. That's the Nile turned to blood. So let me just read the 5 of those verses 20 through 25 again. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water in the Nile turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt, but the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. So that's the last 5 verses of the chapter. Now the setting, let's just talk about that a little bit. The setting of this confrontation is pretty ironic. It's ironic that Moses meets Pharaoh along the bank of the Nile. It harkens back to Pharaoh's decree after the midwives episode that, quote, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile. That was Exodus 2:22. The Nile was, of course, the place where Moses had been placed in the basket as a baby, Exodus 2:3. So just by virtue of the setting, things have come full circle. Again, there's a lot of irony here. We could also note how the Egyptian magicians, they do the same thing. They turn the water to blood. But you realize, again, in light of what we've talked about as far as especially the decreation view, they show by doing that they don't have the power to restore Ma'at either. Pharaoh's the one who's expected to be able to do this. Certainly not his magicians, his handymen, his priestly henchmen, or whatever you want to call these guys. So they make the problem worse. They actually, undermine in a peripheral way Pharaoh's own status. I mean, he's the one who's supposed to be able to reverse this. Oh, yeah, we'll help you out here. We'll make it worse. He can't do anything. So again, there's a lot of irony in that as well, and there's a lot of theological irony, theological polemic there too. So let's talk about the decreation assault, the assault on Ma'at thing, and the polemic with the first plague, more specifically. Now, the Nile's annual flooding, again, was referred to as the inundation in academic literature. That was actually deified. That was the inundation itself was like a deity concept or a deity sort of thing or figure. Currid notes, quote, the Nile's inundation was deified and personified as the Egyptian god Hapi. That's Hapi. In fact, as early as the pyramid texts, the Egyptians called the Nile River by the divine name Hapi. They often portrayed the god as a bearded man with female breasts and a hanging stomach, probably to show pregnancy, all of which reflect the concept of fertility. Okay? And indeed, Egyptian writings spoke of Hapi as the one who kept Egypt alive. The hymn to the Nile, for example, taught that life in Egypt came from the Nile. Quote, O all men who uphold the Aeneid. That's a group of deities. Fear ye the majesty which his Son, the All-Lord, has made by making verdant the 2 banks. So it is, verdant art thou. So it is, verdant art thou. So it is, O Nile, verdant art thou, who makest man and cattle to live. Verdant is just another term for life-giving, okay? So this is a hymn to the Nile. Again, that in Egyptian theology, all life comes from the Nile. So it's bad news if the Nile is polluted. And Hapi again, the personified deity figure, the deification of the inundation of the Nile. And when the Nile floods, the inundation, you realize what happens. The Nile floods, it overflows its banks, and that deposits rich soil on either side of the Nile. That's why things can grow. And this isn't like just a few yards. This is miles of soil. This is how Egyptian people eat. They can't grow their crops in sand and in the desert. They depend on the annual regular inundation of the Nile to survive. And again, they refer to the inundation as the deity Hapi. Well, Hapi is either not doing the job, or Hapi is weak. Okay, he or she, again, it's sort of a hybrid figure, is weak, when compared next to the God of Israel. The God of Israel has mastered Hapi. It's the God of Israel, the God of the Hebrews that Pharaoh will not recognize, who actually controls the Nile. Again, it's a theological lesson, and a pretty frightening one, and one that would make the Egyptians angry, and especially Pharaoh. I mean, probably frightened most of the populace, but Pharaoh, again, he knows what everyone else in the room is thinking. Everyone else in the country is thinking. You're the son of Ra. You are the maintainer of Ma'at. Do something about it. And he can't. He just can't. I mean, it's a public humiliation. It's a public display, not only of Pharaoh, again, perceived as a deity incarnate, not only of Pharaoh's fecklessness, but also Hapi's. And this is how the plagues are going to work. You're going to have decreation elements, and that are going to serve as a general attack on Ma'at, which is by definition an attack on Pharaoh and his status and his power, his divinity. Okay, but you're also going to have individual plagues belittle, make small and show to be weak specific Egyptian deities. So I think both of these things are in play. And to end our episode here, Currid summarizes it this way. This disaster, again, it's just starting with the first plague, this disaster was a demonstration that the true sustenance came only from the hand of Yahweh and not from a false pagan deity of the Egyptians. It's a threat to Egyptian religion generally, because if this condition persists, and the other plagues are going to sort of back up the same point. Might the Egyptians be thinking, well, maybe we should worship Yahweh because he's the one that keeps us alive anyway? I mean, this is what's at stake. So you have all of this going on, again, in the backdrop of the Egyptian mind, and the Hebrews. The Hebrews are well aware of this stuff. They've been in Egypt a long time. They sort of know the drill. I'm not going to say they're experts in Egyptian theology, but they kind of know the drill. They kind of know what Egyptians think and how they think about Pharaoh and all that sort of stuff. So what we'll do next time, and again, we'll process the rest of the plagues in the same manner as polemic and as, again, this anti-Ma'at decreation sort of idea. Exodus 10, has the rest of the plagues. I don't know if we can hit them all in one episode or not, but probably, a couple episodes, who knows? But this is how we're going to do it. We're going to go through each of the plagues and talk about how they reinforce both of these approaches to what's going on.